My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you to a webinar devoted to the nuclear risk reduction, including in the NPT review conference context. Nuclear risk reduction issues have become quite prominent in the past number of years, including within the discussion of the upcoming NPT review conference and the NPT review cycle in general. The risk reduction is a subject that has been extensively examined by a number of academic institutions, researchers, but it's also a subject of the discussion of a number of governmental initiatives, particularly the Stockholm Initiative, that has been looking at a number of issues related to nuclear disarmament and risk reduction. And the Stockholm Initiative, members of it issued a working paper in advance of the upcoming NPT review conference that gave us a good reason to conduct this workshop and have a more focused discussion on the risk reduction measures, on risk reduction and its standing in the NPT review conference. For that, we have an outstanding panelist today to discuss these issues. And we will start with, I'll first give the floor to Ambassador Ann-Sofie Nilsson, who is Sweden's Ambassador for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, to speak about the Stockholm Initiative and the introduction of the risk reduction topic. And then we'll have a panel discussion with the Deputy Head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Section at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, Reto Wollenmann, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, Ambassador Aidan Liddle, Council and Political Coordinator at the mission of Mexico to the United Nations in New York, Tony Jaquez, and Dr. Heather Williams, who is Stanton Fellow, Nuclear Security Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the discussion in the panel will be moderated by my colleague, Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, who is a director of the International Organizations and Non-Proliferation Program at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Once again, welcome everyone to the VCDNP webinar, and Ambassador Nilsson, this is my pleasure to give you the floor and to say a few words on behalf of the Stockholm Initiative.
Thank you very much, and it's of course a pleasure to be part of this workshop this afternoon from Stockholm. And thank you so much to Vienna Center, Elena, for you and your Gaukhar and your colleagues for putting this event together. I will say a few words of the Stockholm Initiative and what we do and where we are in our preparations ahead of the 10th review conference of the NPT. As you know, colleagues, we do live in complicated times in disarmament and non-proliferation. The arms control architecture continues since a long time to be under stress, and multilateral solutions and institutions are being challenged in time of increased political and security polarization. We also see a rapid technological development inside and outside the nuclear field that is not yet fully understood, but needs to be followed closely. because we of course know that any mistake in the nuclear area would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences. These are really the reasons why the countries of the Stockholm Initiative, composed by 16 non-nuclear weapon states from various regions and security contexts, got together in 2019 and decided to jointly work for what we would like, together with others, of course, a positive and a forward-looking outcome of the next review conference. And our focus within the initiative is very much on looking at the implementation and concrete progress on commitments made, and searching for what we would call a common ground, and focusing specifically on the nuclear disarmament pillar, even if, of course, all the three pillars of the NPT are as important, but this is our specific focus of the initiative. And what we have seen ahead of the conference, and as you said, Elena, that risk reduction is both what we believe an interesting and hopefully a promising field for real progress. And we've seen that other states, parties, groupings, and initiatives have put risk reduction on their agenda. And that goes also for the nuclear weapon states within their own P5 process. And I'm sure we'll learn from Aidan on that in a little while. And as you said, Elena, so have we within the Stockholm Initiative. When our ministers, they met in Berlin last year, they agreed on a political declaration that also stated that now is the time to take action to reduce nuclear risk. They agreed on a stepping stones annex in that meeting, which is both an approach and a methodology, and 22 concrete stepping stones for action that cover a number of areas in the nuclear field. And we strongly believe if these proposals would be implemented, it would make both a real difference immediately and now, but they could also lead to further progress on nuclear disarmament down the road. And within the Stockholm Initiative, Switzerland has then during this last year taken the lead in working out a separate work stream focusing on risk reduction. And that is, of course, building upon some of the stepping stones that we had agreed upon. And just a few weeks ago, we endorsed this paper, and together with a few other also very engaged non-nuclear weapon states have submitted this paper as a working paper to the RevCon. And you will hear more from Reto Wollenmann, who's the expert on this, but I really want to say that Switzerland, I want to thank you for this excellent work and for also developing and conceptualizing the risk reduction theme through this package for nuclear risk reduction. And we will learn more about it in the afternoon. Finally, before I hand over to the panelists, I look really forward to listening to you. I think there are a lot of things that we can do now. As you said, Elena, there is both research and there is political engagement. Maybe not all can be done today or tomorrow, but this is definitely an area where we should not work in silos. We should continue the engagement, and we should definitely act upon what is possible here and now. And we have a few more months as it looks, and let us take those weeks and months ahead and continue this discussion. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Nilsson. And before I pass the floor to Gaukhar to moderate the discussion, I also wanted to acknowledge that this webinar actually is the first in a series that the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation plans to conduct in the run-up to the NPT review conference. and we will cover different topics, including the past commitments to the made at the review conference, some other issues. But I just want to use this opportunity to thank the Austrian Foreign Ministry for supporting our initial initiative to conduct a series of these webinars, and particularly Ambassador Hainosi, who was immediately very supportive of the idea of having a series of these webinars. So we'll continue with them, and we hope you will be checking our website for future announcement about discussions on all of these important topics related to the NPT. And without further ado, let's jump into the discussion. And Gaukhar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena, and welcome all the speakers. Thank you for joining us. And as announced by Elena, we're going to move on to the panel discussion part of this. And I'm pleased to give the floor first to Reto Wollenmann to introduce the Stockholm Initiative paper on nuclear risk reduction and the main proposals contained in it. Reto, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elena. Thank you, Gaukhar, for organizing this event and for giving us the opportunity to discuss how nuclear risk reduction could be advanced in the run-up to the 10th NPT review conference and beyond. And thanks also to Ann-Sofie for her kind introductory remarks and for outlining the Stockholm Initiative's work and how the work on risk reduction fits in the broader picture of this initiative. I will, of course, also speak in national capacity, not on behalf of the Stockholm Initiative's members, even though the paper that we have all endorsed as an initiative is at the center of my remarks. So, Excellencies, dear colleagues, as Elena said, in recent months, many events, discussions, studies have underlined strong interest in nuclear risks and nuclear risk reduction. These discussions have also shown that there are a lot of ideas out there, and they have also shown that it is a complex topic. And discussions have also shown that there seems to be a growing conviction that nuclear risk reduction should be advanced as a priority at the 10th NPT review conference. So I think today is another great opportunity to compare notes in an informal setting to prepare for the 10th NPT review conference. I think such discussions have only become more important as the NPT timeline continues to evolve, and I think it's great that we can get into substance while the procedural issues are still open. So Switzerland has been quite active on the issue of nuclear risks and nuclear risk reductions over several years and on multiple fronts. And just a few points at the beginning to position our efforts. We have been engaged in this area actually since 2010, 2012, also in the context of the discussions on catastrophic unitarian consequences. And one of the studies we supported at the very beginning in this regard was Chatham House's Too Close for Comfort in 2014, with Heather Williams as a co-author and a real eye-opener for many, which pointed out that the probability of inadvertent nuclear use is not zero and higher than previously understood. We've also been presenting the de-alerting resolution in the General Assembly with our partners Chile, Malaysia, Nigeria, New Zealand, and Sweden, which calls for practical and concrete measures to reduce the readiness of nuclear weapon systems. This is one part of risk reduction, though risk reduction, of course, is much broader. And then we took the lead in taking forward Action 6 of the UN Secretary General's disarmament agenda, which was published 3 years ago and became a multi-year funder of UNIDIR's work in that matter, in that area. Another example, we work with the Institute for Security and Technology to support a proposal for an international hotline system, multilateral, reliable, robust, trustworthy crisis communication technology that would allow communication in times of crisis in order to avoid nuclear escalation. And in the context of the Stockholm Initiative, Switzerland has contributed to anchoring nuclear risk reduction in the Berlin Declaration, as outlined a moment ago by Ann-Sofie, and building on the strong language in the Berlin Declaration and on the And building also on the 22 stepping stones, many of which are relevant for nuclear risk reduction, Switzerland has drafted this working paper in view of the 10th Review Conference. The paper was formally submitted a couple of weeks ago on behalf of the 16 members of the initiative, and so far 4 additional states have co-sponsored it. So let me say a few words about this paper, which UNODA tells me will be published as working paper 9, and you will also find it on Sweden's Stockholm Initiative website as a PDF version. You can find it easily there. The starting point of that paper is that international concerns about nuclear risks have come to the fore in recent times, and that there is a convergence of views of the need to address them as a priority at the REFCON. And the paper identifies a number of developments and trends, including the geopolitical situation, developments related to nuclear weapons themselves, capabilities, the nuclear weapons roles in doctrines, new technological developments, etc. And the paper describes nuclear risks as a multidimensional challenge, so to say. And based on this, the paper takes the approach that we don't just need at the REFCON a nice statement in the final document or a commitment here or a measure there, but rather takes the approach that a package of measures would be needed, not only for the nuclear weapon states, but also the non-nuclear weapon states. So a broad range of possible ways forward in an inclusive approach, underlining that this is a joint project that must include, as I said, the nuclear weapon states, which bear the primary responsibility and play the key role, but also the non-nuclear weapon states. And I will get to this a little bit later. And we do present in the paper concrete options also for a process in the understanding that the REFCON as such is just one moment in time. We need a sustained effort, and we need a process to make progress. So another point I would like to emphasize at the beginning is that the paper is based on the understanding that nuclear risk reduction is not an alternative to nuclear disarmament. On the contrary, in our view, risk reduction is an integral part of broader disarmament efforts. It's implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. It's upholding and taking forward existing disarmament commitments. And this is also why we have this strong and explicit reference to Action 5 of the 2010 NPT Action Plan, under which the nuclear weapon states commit to accelerate concrete progress on a number of actions leading to nuclear disarmament. And many of these, if you look at the text, many of them actually relate directly to risk reduction measures, as now contained also in our paper. And I would also add that risk reduction, pending the total elimination of nuclear weapons, of course, can create more space for disarmament. So we are convinced that each step that makes the world safer creates space for deeper cuts. I wanted to make those 2 points at the outset, and I would now look a little bit more closely at the paper. It consists of 5 parts. First, and the first part, it actually proposes or considers language for a collective statement as part of the outcome document. It refers to expressing deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences if these weapons are used again, and declares that it's in the interest of humanity that nuclear weapons are never used again. And it also mentions the Reagan-Gorbachev statement and proposes to build on that statement. And I think there is hope, of course, these days that the upcoming Biden-Putin summit mid-June in Geneva can trigger a much-needed discussion on such declaratory commitments in view also of the NPT outcome document. Secondly, the paper calls for renewed commitment by the nuclear weapon states and a broader dialogue on risks. It proposes actually that the 10th Review Conference should trigger specific cooperation between the 5 nuclear weapon states. They have already engaged on strategic risk reduction, and I'm sure Ambassador Liddle will refer to this in a moment, but invites the nuclear weapon states to expand their work in this area by making nuclear risk reduction really a priority area of action, a permanent item on the agenda of their meetings by establishing working groups dealing with specific related topics. And I think that will be very important. I understand that also other groups like the European Leadership Network are proposing such working group action. And I think that would be something that should be considered by the P5 in their meetings. Thirdly, the document proposes measures by all states. I mentioned that at the beginning. It emphasizes that nuclear risk reduction is a shared responsibility and requires an inclusive approach. Every state can make contributions to easing tensions. Every state can participate in some CBMs or other relevant initiatives, be they regional or global. And fourth, the paper encourages further research, new partnerships, innovative approaches to advance the issue. We know that we can already build on a very solid academic work in this area, but we think that more work could be done in the years to come. And that's very much part of this package philosophy. Fifth, and I referred to this already at the beginning, the paper argues that a process is needed to take nuclear risk reduction forward. On the one hand, within the NPT, risk reduction should become a permanent agenda item in the NPT meetings, allowing for a structured, results-oriented discussion and ensuring that the NPT can take stock in the coming cycle, in the future cycles, and make informed decisions of what needs to be done. And it also contains some proposals for taking nuclear risk reduction to the next stage, so to say, forward beyond the NPT and the 10th Review Conference, making reference to the possible role a UN process could play. These are some initial ideas. Of course, this is food for thought beyond the review conference and cannot be decided, of course, by the review conference itself. But it's one of the kind of things that we see possibly on the trajectory looking forward beyond the REFCON. So what can be done in the lead up to the REFCON? The paper that I've just presented has already been co-sponsored by 20 states. It will remain open for co-sponsorship in the months to come. It is only one paper. No doubt other papers will follow. And we hope, we suggest that these proposals should be discussed in formats such as this ahead of the REFCON. The new timeline gives us ample time to do so. And we hope that such exchanges, such preparatory work can actually prepare for the negotiations during the REFCON and build momentum around this issue, present concrete language, and show or give indications what type of proposals would find support and where perhaps also more work is needed. And I already said that we, of course, hope that the P5 under the French presidency would take this up in their meetings between now and the review conference. We invite them to consider proposals that are on the table, this one, but also others, and hope they will come prepared on this matter at the review conference, perhaps even with their own concrete suggestions. That would be, I think, very, very useful. And as I mentioned, a positive signal from the Geneva summit could, of course, facilitate such work very much. We're also aware that some of the approaches in the paper are perhaps technically rather complicated, and we are just testing the ideas. So some of the ideas in there could perhaps also be looked at a little bit more in detail. Would be interesting to do that in the lead up to the discussion, look at the specific proposals. How would it work? What exactly would be the roles of nuclear weapon states, of non-nuclear weapon states, of civil society, etc. So there's plenty of work to do. Before I conclude, I would like to say that the process in the initiative has been very rewarding. The initiative, as you know, represents a significant part of the spectrum of the non-nuclear weapon states. And they all approach these consultations with a high degree of flexibility. And we arrived in the end at a consensus on a paper. And I think it is not the lowest common denominator possible in this area, but actually rather a comprehensive package. And I think that should give us room for optimism. I think such papers can inspire discussions, and be of value as we move forward in view of the review conference. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you very much for this great introduction of the paper. And nuclear weapon states and the P5 process came up several times in your remarks with regard to the future work. And this is a great segue to our next speaker, Ambassador Aidan Liddle, representing the United Kingdom, who will talk about the nuclear weapon state perspective on nuclear risk reduction and possibly provide some reactions to the working paper. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Great, thank you very much, Gaukhar, and thanks for inviting me along to speak today on this. It's a really interesting topic, and it's something that, as has already been noted, is getting, I think, quite a lot of momentum. So it's very timely that we're discussing this. And I think the first thing to say is that certainly we as the UK really welcome the Stockholm Initiative's engagement on this. I think it's a really good. It's a good spread of countries representing lots of different regions and lots of different strands of opinion amongst the non-nuclear weapon states, and there's lots of great expertise represented there. So it's really good to have the Stockholm Initiative really sort of diving into this question in some depth. I suppose the second point I'd make, just by way of introduction, is really very much to echo what Reto said, that we very much realise and recognise that talking about risk reduction is not a substitute for disarmament. But I think it's self-evidently a good thing. We are all in the business of preventing nuclear war by one way or the other, and this is obviously what it's all about. So I don't think it should be a controversial thing for us to be working on, because I think it's obviously in all our interests that we do that. But I think Reto's right that it can also create the conditions for real disarmament in terms of reductions of warheads and eliminations of systems, because the more you reduce the risk, the more you increase stability, the more likely it is that the nuclear weapon states feel able to take those next steps. So I think this is a contribution to nuclear disarmament, but it is not, and a good thing in its own right, but it is not obviously disarmament itself. But I think in that spirit, and given the sort of geopolitical position we're in, it's a very good thing for the NPT to be focusing on. I'll talk briefly about the UK's perspective, and then I'll come on to what the P5 is doing, and then perhaps at the end just touch briefly on some reactions to the proposals. In introducing the UK position, I'll just start by quoting directly from our integrated review, which we published back in March. And the very final paragraph of the section on the nuclear deterrent says this: the UK will continue to work internationally to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict and enhance mutual trust and security. We will champion strategic risk reduction and seek to create dialogue among states possessing nuclear weapons and between states possessing nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapon states to increase understanding and reduce the risk of misinterpretation and miscalculation. So there already in our national security doctrine, you have a very clear commitment to risk reduction, but also a suggestion of what it means to the UK. And perspectives will differ, but this is very much what we look at it, how we look at it. So a couple of things to take away from that. Firstly, note we talk about states possessing nuclear weapons. That's deliberately framed to include states possessing nuclear weapons outside the NPT. And I know we're talking specifically about the NPT here, and the Stockholm Initiative is focused on the NPT, but nuclear risk reduction for us is not just confined to the NPT. And in fact, I think it's probably fair to say that the sort of largest focus of nuclear risk in the world at the moment probably lies outside the NPT. But I'll leave that to one side for the moment, important though it is. The second thing to take away from that is that we use the word strategic risk reduction, and I think that's you can sort of debate about the semantics of this, but the reason we prefer that formulation is because it focuses much more clearly on the prevention of nuclear war, as the CD agenda item has it. So it's about reducing the risk of conflict that neither side intended, expected, or deliberately prepared for. Now that's not to say that there isn't an element about safety and security, and I think probably the broader nuclear risk reduction framing might bring in questions about safety and security of nuclear weapons. They are important, not least for reassuring our own domestic populations that our nuclear weapons are safe and secure. But again, it's probably a risk in outside the, it's probably more of a risk outside the NPT nuclear weapons states than inside. And I think when we're talking about the sort of more, I think when we're talking about contributions to disarmament and creating the environment for nuclear disarmament, it is much more that sort of strategic piece that we think is more valuable to focus on. So to sort of break down that framing then of strategic risk reduction, I think it's about sort of two or three different things really. Firstly, it's around misinterpretation. So one of the big risks that we see is misinterpretation of an adversary's intentions, capabilities, and actions. So one of the important things when you're talking about reducing strategic risk is trying to increase understanding and clarity about intentions, capabilities, and actions. The second area is around miscalculation. So this is a failure to foresee consequences of ambiguous actions or maneuvers or the accumulation of irreversible threats, or the failure to understand where an adversary's thresholds might be. So obviously it's very closely linked to the first set of issues. You can miscalculate through misinterpretation. But you can also miscalculate through your own actions as well and how they might be interpreted by others. So I think they're the two sides of the same coin, but I think they're both extremely important and potentially quite complicated. But there's also a third element, which is to recognize that this is also about lowering the risk of conventional conflicts, because of course, if you look at nuclear escalatory ladders, you don't start with nuclear weapons. You get to nuclear or circumstances of nuclear use through other stages. So recognizing how to minimize or eliminate the risk of conventional conflict breaking out, or at least escalating to the stage at which you might reach nuclear thresholds, is a very important part of nuclear risk reduction, even if you're not actually talking about nuclear use. And again, there are other scenarios in the world outside the NPT where that's particularly relevant. So if this is what we understand by strategic risk reduction as the UK, I think we see three elements of ways we might deal with it. The first is through building trust and confidence, and again, we already mentioned this in the integrated review about building trust and confidence between states. So you know, it's potentially a sort of framing thing. It might not only be directly contributing to discussing nuclear use, but it's obviously it's very important for building that sort of atmosphere in which you can discuss these things dispassionately. The second element is around increasing mutual understanding, and that speaks directly to the elements I was talking about before. So understanding each other's capabilities and intentions and doctrines, and how they might be used in times of crisis. And then the third element is around developing and using effective crisis management and prevention tools. Again, both conventional and nuclear. But that can be things like hotlines, like military-to-military channels, ballistic missile launch notification. There's a whole series of tools, some of which go back to the Cold War and others of which might need to be developed today, given the multiplicity of nuclear reactors, new technologies, that sort of thing. But there are already tools in the locker that we can use. So that's a sort of brief word about how the UK sees all of this. Now, through the P5 process, which I think is a trust and confidence building measure in its own right, and therefore a risk reduction measure in its own right, the P5 process has looked at this quite a lot over the last couple of years. Obviously, as Reto said, France is now coordinating the process, but the UK was doing that from the third PrepCom up until sometime in the middle of last year, and we developed some thinking on this already in our time. So I think the first thing that we have been working on, particularly in this review cycle, is exchanges around doctrines. And as I say, if one of the areas of strategic risk reduction is around, or areas of strategic risk is around misinterpretation of each other's doctrines and capabilities, then it follows that having an exchange around those doctrines at expert level is a very clear risk reduction measure. So we've been doing that over the last couple of years. There's much more we can do and much further we can take it. But we've made a start on that, and I think there's more we can do. But that's an important start. The corollary of that is that there is useful work we can do at P5 on this, but it's no substitute for really in-depth bilateral strategic stability talks. Obviously, the US and Russia, we hope, as Reto said, will be getting back to those sorts of exchanges very soon, and Presidents Biden and Putin have already signaled their intention to do that. But there is more scope for that. Obviously, the US and China, I think we would certainly encourage a similar dialogue there, because that's an important area which is not yet covered, and there are probably others as well. The other thing that P5 have been working on is sort of declaratory commitments of their own. Reagan Gorbachev was mentioned. The world has moved on quite a lot since 1985. But I think there is room for a common P5 statement of what we understand by the way of sort of declaratory commitments in 2021. So that's something that's under discussion. We are hoping that we might be able to table a P5 working paper on this, on strategic risk reduction in general. And we very much hope to have a commitment to continue and deepen this dialogue into the next review cycle, both on the doctrines piece, but also on the wider strategic risk reduction agenda. So finally, just to wrap up on the Stockholm Initiative proposals themselves, and here, obviously, I can't speak for the P5, and really these are my own sort of personal reflections rather than a UK position. But it should be clear from what I've said that there are very, very obvious areas of overlap when we're talking about things like declaratory commitments, the role of the P5 and what the P5 dialogue might look like over the next review cycle, and this idea of building on and developing our crisis management toolbox. These are all things that we're already talking about, both as the UK and in the P5, and there's obvious overlap there with what the Stockholm Initiative paper sets out. So I think there's some really fruitful issues that we can get into at the RevCon on that. The other element is probably about the follow-up process, and I think here it's a bit too early to say. I mean, the Stockholm Initiative paper talks about GGEs or agenda items in the NPT or working groups and that sort of thing. Form will always follow function, and there will obviously be good discussions about the substance, and we'll need to then understand what we need to do to take forward those discussions. So I think it's a bit early yet to be thinking about those, but obviously having come up with an agreement at the RevCon on what we're going to do, we also need to understand how we're going to take those forward. So it's important to get those on the table as well. So all in all, I think there's a lot of common ground there, and I think this is a really fruitful area for the RevCon. So once again, I'd like to thank Reto and his team in the Swiss government for taking this forward, and to Ann-Sofie and the Stockholm Initiative for putting this on the table. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Both you and Reto emphasized the point that was a bit of a concern for a number of states at the beginning of nuclear risk reduction discussions, and that was whether or not this is going to be a replacement sort of for the conversation about the real nuclear disarmament, whether this is going to be an impediment to considering more ambitious measures and programs. And I'm very glad to have our next speaker who comes from a very strong disarmament background nationally and personally, and as part of a new agenda coalition as well. And I'm really looking forward to your comments. Tony Jaquez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gaukhar. Thank you to the VCDNP for inviting me and for giving me the chance to offer some perspective from the point of view of non-nuclear weapon states and a country that is not in the original Stockholm Initiative on this very important paper, but also on the important issue of risk reduction. I think that it is easy to participate and to offer these views after the very substantive explanation of what the discussion has entailed so far, or the issues that both the Stockholm Initiative and other initiatives are focusing on. I just want to say first and foremost why this issue can work at the review conference of the NPT, because this is the focus of the webinar, and also when it might not be successful from my point of view. And I am going to start there. I don't want to start from a negative point, but I think we need to re-emphasize something that has already been said by Ambassador Nilsson and Ambassador Liddle, of course, by Gaukhar, and the paper itself. So we have to set three conditions for this issue to work at the review conference. Okay, so the first one has already been mentioned, that this is not a substitute for the discussion on nuclear disarmament, but also for tangible progress in fulfilling the obligations under the treaty. Of course, obligations for all the parties of the treaty, but specifically for nuclear weapon states. And I have to stop here and make a bit of a footnote, because many papers and initiatives and groupings are referring constantly to the frustration of the non-nuclear weapon states. I don't like this categorization. It's not mine, but everybody talks about it, so I need to refer to it. And one of the frustrations, if we call them with that name, is the tend of to evade or to go around in circles about obligations under the treaty, especially obligations of the nuclear weapon states. So the problem that or the discomfort, if we want to call it like that many non-nuclear weapon states have posed in the discussions around this issue and other issues, because this is not the only one that is of concern, is that this can be seen as a deviation again from talking about the obligations under the treaty. So I need to say this, first and foremost, we need to establish not only that this is not a substitution for tangible progress in nuclear disarmament, but that this is not a substitution for the talk on obligations and commitments on the treaty. The other condition is that this does not legitimate nuclear weapons, unintentionally or intentionally, okay? Because there is also one branch or one avenue of discussion that ends up with a oversimplification, saying, well, of course, nuclear weapons are okay and are necessary and are important and useful for strategic stability as long as the risks are reduced. And for a group of states, this is like nails on the board, on the chalkboard, when we are talking about the review of the NPT and the purposes of the NPT. So maybe we need to be careful about how these narratives are being misconstrued around maybe a legitimate concern, which is the risk itself. So I said that this is a legitimate concern because it goes without saying that the NPT has been very successful in avoiding or in stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon states. We don't have as many as everybody thought that there would be, but nuclear weapons still exist, and the risk is still there, and the risk is growing, as Heather and Reto have already explained in their papers, and the purpose of this webinar has already stated. But the reason why this has to be mentioned is that the third condition for this to work is that the risk reduction measures are seen as interim measures and intermediate steps, not the final steps, because the NPT has very clear objectives, and the whole nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime is built on these objectives. So we cannot change track and say, let's not talk about these objectives anymore because most of them are already fulfilled. excepting with the nuclear disarmament ones that are not really obligations, somebody might say, but in an ironic way. But if they have already been set out, now let's focus on the issue that keeps growing, which is the risk. And I think that this is a valid updating of the talk of the NPT in the NPT cycle, and we need to address that, but not in substitution of the review of the commitments and obligations inside the treaty. So, if these three conditions are fulfilled, there is a chance that there is enough confidence in the process to build on some consensual elements and maybe new ideas, as the ones expressed in the Stockholm Initiative paper, can land on the outcomes and agreed by the whole membership and the whole group of parties of the NPT. So for that to happen, there has to be another understanding. This is not a condition. I don't categorize this as a condition, but an understanding that when we talk about nuclear risk reduction, we're talking about a subjective concept of perception. I think that Ambassador Liddle said it very well, that it is everything is about the misconception, misconstruction, and I also added the mistrust and the lack of confidence in what we're doing. And I think that is what needs to be addressed, but it is very, very subjective. So that's why there are so many interpretations. And unfortunately, non-nuclear weapon states are constantly under pressure for accepting some ideas that cannot make their own. For example, in nuclear weapon states, and the P5 process has been very emphatic in demonstrating that the reductions in the arsenals that have existed in the 50 years of the treaty are one of the successes of the treaty, and we need to believe they are, without any verification, multilateral verification, or without a lot of transparency from all of the nuclear weapon states at the same level. So, and nuclear weapon states need to demonstrate this, and non-nuclear weapon states need to believe this. Okay, and this type of processes or narratives inside an NPT, this arise from the way the NPT is built. This is not anybody's fault, but these have been constructing some mistrust and some lack of confidence throughout the years. And the very important narrative about reducing risk is not foreign to this lack of confidence and for lack of common understanding. Then the last thing I want to say regarding the RevCon is that for many parties of the treaty, nuclear risk reduction means a different thing. It's not the risk. It's not reducing the risk of nuclear war. It's reducing the risk posed by the continued existence of nuclear weapons. And this goes hand in hand with the conditions that I set out in the beginning about making this not a substitute or a smoke curtain, not to talk about the obligations in the treaty. So many states have said that this has to do more with the assertion or the reaffirmation of the concern regarding the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons and the risk of detonation, even if it's not intentional or if it's not in a war, and that also has to be addressed in some way or fashion. So I think that the way these can be tied together, the talk about the concern of humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the catastrophe that might arise from the use of nuclear weapon with the risk of increasing risk of nuclear war. It can be more dialogue amongst the NPT parties, of course, as we are doing about what this means, what can be done, how can this be expressed in the context of the NPT. So in that regard, the Stockholm Initiative document is very useful because it gathers some previous commitments and assertions and understandings in the context of the NPT in a way that merges the two channels that I am talking about, one about the existence of nuclear weapons, the other about the existence of the risk of nuclear war. And it also gives some important updated items that were not discussed before, I think, in the NPT context, like the use of new technologies that is something that is of concern. But it is useful to see that in the paper. So I congratulate the authors of the paper, especially Switzerland, that has led this issue for many years, as Reto has explained. I think that one of the important also issues that we need to consider, and that I would like to finish my intervention here with is that there, even though there are obligations and comments and participation of the non-nuclear weapon states in the risk reduction measures, as the paper has separated some calls and encouragement for the non-nuclear weapon states and some for the nuclear weapon states. I think that is useful, but we should not overboard more obligations on the non-nuclear weapon states besides the ones that are already the bulk of the treaty, because this is one of the source of mistrust and misunderstanding. So I agree that it is a little bit soon to tell whether this will be agreed in this form by the RevCon, but I think it is important to continue looking into the forward-looking proposals of the paper, like an open-ended working group or a GGE, as long as it doesn't create a new process or it doesn't create a new layer of countries that participate in this and countries that don't participate in this, as if there is no endorsement for these proposals. So one has to be careful about not creating new layers in an already very asymmetrical treaty, like the NPT and the NPT regime is. So with that, I would finish, and I would like to again express my thanks for the opportunity to give an opinion on these issues, and congratulations to the participants.
Thank you very much, Tony, for an excellent commentary. And now we're turning to our final speaker, and it's a person coming from the academic world and one of the academics who has been most engaged on the subject from the fairly early on. So we're very pleased to have you, Heather. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gaukhar. Also, thank you, Elena, for the invitation. I also just want to thank the organizers of the Stockholm Initiative for inviting an NGO academic perspective to be part of these discussions. We aren't always invited in. So this was really a nice opportunity. What I'm going to talk about, I'm just really going to make 3 points. I'm going to point to something that was included in the paper that I think is really worth highlighting. I'm going to point to something that is noticeably absent from the paper that I wanted to flag, and then some specific ideas for beyond RevCon, actually, because I think that RevCon is kind of almost upon us, maybe, we're not sure, but I think that this initiative in this paper has value beyond whenever RevCon happens. Also, at the outset, I just really want to commend Sweden for bringing together such a diverse and rich group of states and perspectives. I also want to commend Switzerland and I assume Reto for drafting what I think is a really excellent paper on risk reduction. And I say that as an academic, like I would include this in academic coursework because I think it's so well done. I also think it's a real masterclass in compromise, and as you said, in this inclusive approach. So jumping in, what is in the paper that I really want to highlight? It is this humanitarian framing. From the very outset, the paper plants its flag in the ground, linking the initiative to humanitarian consequences and concerns. The humanitarian aspect is mentioned nearly a dozen times explicitly. That's a lot for a relatively short document. And it directly links these humanitarian concerns to the NPT. Given the diversity of participants that you can see involved, I think this is really important. It shows that a diversity of states with different ideas about security, about deterrence, that they can agree on this type of language. That suggests humanitarian approaches to nuclear weapons and nuclear issues. They are not solely the concern of non-nuclear weapons states or of the TPNW supporters. Indeed, these humanitarian concerns align with the NPT itself. And the humanitarian angle, I know this is impossible, but I think the humanitarian angle just should not be as politicized as it has become. These are universal concerns. Similarly, I would say that it shows humanitarian approaches are not mutually exclusive from security concerns and from sovereignty issues. Indeed, humanitarian approaches and security concerns are deeply intertwined. As I'll discuss next, I think the paper just finds a really good balance of recognizing states' rights to their own security and defense, along with the collective risks of nuclear weapons miscalculation. But getting that balance right, I'm guessing, was quite difficult. I also, and one kind of offshoot of this that I thought was so important is the section on education and the importance of nuclear education to include on humanitarian consequences. The paper captures this really nicely, and I thought was one of the more important sections. I would hope to see similar language carried over into some sort of consensus document at the RevCon. I also think that how maybe we as NGOs and academics can take this forward is identifying specific topics that would be the most important in nuclear education. That would absolutely include humanitarian consequences, hearing the testimony of survivors. It would also include familiarity with treaties and various obligations. It would also include discussions of nuclear deterrence. But I do think this, just focusing on this humanitarian aspect, was worth pausing and reflecting on, because it really is woven throughout the document, I thought. So next, what was not in the paper? This would be there was no specific statement on no first use or sole purpose, despite a section that was explicitly on declaratory policy. This surprised me somewhat. It largely leaves it up to the nuclear weapon states to address their own declaratory policy, to address risks, either unilaterally, bilaterally, or multilaterally. It's not overly prescriptive. I think that is appropriate for states that continue to rely on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence for security purposes. It isn't saying we're going to tell you how to manage your security too explicitly. What this suggests to me, again, I think that the absence of an explicit recommendation for no first use or sole purpose, I think that this reflects the inclusive approach that was clearly prioritized in this initiative. It is the strength of this initiative. To me, this omission is not accidental. It implies that some of the participants might not be amenable to no first use or sole purpose declaration at this time. As I said, I really commend the authors for finding this middle ground and still including some language on the issue, but ultimately leaving it up to the nuclear weapon states themselves, while encouraging doctrines that reduce the role of nuclear weapons, prevent escalation, and promote transparency. In terms of the way ahead for this, I'll just lay my cards on the table, I guess, that I think states that are considering no first use or sole purpose, mainly the United States, I think that this omission from this document should send a really strong signal to proceed with caution for any state that is considering changes in its declaratory policy. And I would also think that it would be worthwhile for them to engage with the Stockholm Initiative and the organizers, because I suspect that you have gone through a lot of these discussions yourselves and considered the issue. And so I think that might have laid some really important groundwork in exploring the various views on sole purpose in particular. And so again, I commend you for that. Last kind of points I wanted to make is, what does this mean beyond the RevCon, right? And I think that my comments really follow nicely on from Tony's points, because I think that the challenge for this initiative and for all of us is going to be this diversity of views on how we define risk reduction. As Tony said, this is subjective. The paper really nicely captures the wide spectrum of views of how various states define risk reduction. On the one hand, you have those that say, it's full elimination, that's the only way to reduce risks. On the other, there's this focus on strategic risk reduction. I think that the current work and the momentum that we have on risk reduction, it will be helpful going into RevCon. It is going to provide some areas for common ground. But this diversity of views, it's not going to change. It's not going away. It's going to be a challenge going forward. So in thinking about how this will all contribute to RevCon, I think we should also be asking ourselves, what do we want this work to do after RevCon? In all likelihood, we will be jumping right into a PrepCom immediately after RevCon. So it seems like a worthwhile question. So I have three, they're not really recommendations, just three ideas for us to consider. So first for the P5, I thought that the recommendations in, I think it's section 8D, are really valuable in recommending dialogue, hotlines, data exchanges, and examining in more detail risks of emerging technologies. I would encourage the P5 to consider using this as almost it's a contribution to their agenda going forward. I've repeatedly suggested that the P5 might provide an agenda for their work for the next year. I really hope that they incorporate these ideas into that. Second idea is for more cooperation between nuclear possessors and non-possessors. One idea here might be if the P5 could invite in some representatives from the Stockholm Initiative to discuss the risk reduction paper specifically. And I would also, I know that this would be contentious, but I do think it'd be worthwhile for the P5 to pick up some of this discussion on humanitarian consequences. The P5 always say, of course, we're aware of humanitarian consequences. They don't like talking about it explicitly. I think it's time for an explicit discussion on this issue. It also, I think the CEND initiative, I saw Ambassador Vananen was on this call, I think, that the Stockholm Initiative might also provide a briefing to the CEND, either in plenary or within the subgroups. And so that's just another way that I think we can really build off of the great work in this paper. And then finally, for the Stockholm Initiative itself, going forward, I really hope that this initiative keeps the inclusive approach that has been outlined and that is reflected in the paper, that it doesn't swing too far from one end of that spectrum on risk reduction to the other, that it can still find that representation of such diverse views. The diversity and credibility of participants, the clear-eyed and very practical approach to nuclear risks are the real strengths of this initiative and this paper. And I think that it will help to maintain some momentum. So just to wrap up, the paper, I think, provides really clear outlines and ideas for the initiative going into RevCon and beyond, education and refining a process. So I do think that, for now we're all thinking about RevCon, but we have to think beyond. And I really hope that the inclusive approach of the paper is also something that, it's not as explicit, it's more of a spirit, but that also is something that we can bring into a RevCon and beyond. And I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Heather. It's very, very good commentary. And now we are ready to go to the discussion. We have received a number of questions already before the webinar even started, and some are coming in right now. For those of you who want to ask a question and haven't done so, please use the Q&A function. Do not use the chat. And I'd like to begin with the second point that Heather highlighted, because it goes directly to quite a number of questions we did receive already. And that's the place of the no first use or sole purpose in the nuclear risk reduction conversation and potential measures. And so Heather has offered her perspective about why this was not included specifically in the paper. And we received several questions, basically to the tune of, how does the Stockholm Initiative approach this issue? Is it one of the measures that they would consider or would consider recommending as part of the nuclear risk reduction measures to be adopted at the RevCon, or just encouraged among the P5? So a natural taker, I think, for this one would be Reto. And then if anyone else wants to react on the point of the sole purpose and no first use, and that would be most welcome. Please, would you like to take this?
I'm not sure. Did you pass the floor to me? I just had a connection problem, but if I
Yes,
yeah?
I designated you as the first responder.
I just seem to have had a little hiccup in the line here, but yes, obviously there is this issue that is not in the paper, and to be honest, I mean, look, if you look at the members of the initiative, there's a lot of states in this initiative that fully support. Like Switzerland does, no first use, sole purpose, and there's also members in there that have stronger disarmament positions. There are states that support the TPNW, that are in favor of a ban on first use of, So I think what is in the paper eventually, and Heather, I think, made that point very well. It's a compromise. It's the result of a specific process under, by the way, a very, very specific circumstances. We were not able to meet in person, and it was not perhaps the most conducive atmosphere to discuss the really hot potatoes. And looking at the composition of the group, I think no first use is, and you see that also with the campaign that has started and picked this up. And as I said, this is just maybe also a product of the specific time and the circumstances in which this has evolved. And you mentioned, Heather, also that this perhaps speaks to the inclusive approach of the initiative. I think for many members of the initiative, it was more important to come with a strong overall comprehensive approach that many of the states, let's say on the nuclear deterrence spectrum, would also read and think, oh, yeah, this is a good basis. And we, for instance, as we also mentioned explicitly in our discussions with the nuclear weapon states, we want this to be the basis of their discussion. So perhaps that led us to not include certain topics. There, no first use is one. There could be also a stronger language on other areas. I think it was at this time perhaps not right, but we still have a little bit of time until the review conference. And if those positions evolve, I think it would be a brilliant topic to include in such a paper.
Thank you. I know that Tony has expressed an interest in addressing this issue as well. Tony, please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. In a way, Reto has already mentioned what I was going to say, which is that sole purpose or no first use declarations are an issue that I think that amongst the nuclear weapon states and other states possessing nuclear weapons has to be addressed, and it would some of them already have a policy of this kind, as we know, and this I am sure that is something that belongs to the meetings, for example, the PIP5 process meetings, and might be a welcome outcome from the possessors. But it is. I don't think that it is possible for non-nuclear weapon states, especially states in nuclear weapon-free zones, to accept the no first use or sole purpose declaration as a new agreement or as a new consensus regarding nuclear weapons, because from the point of view of these states, including Mexico, there is no use for nuclear weapons or purpose, or we have resigned or renounced the possibility of pursuing the nuclear option, and the continued reliance on nuclear weapons is a risk. And the continuous reliance of nuclear weapons is the pending assignment of the NPT objectives, purposes, and also of the United Nations in general's idea of nuclear disarmament. I am just making an announcement because this year we commemorate 75 years of the first resolution of the General Assembly, which was about this. So it would be very difficult for non-nuclear weapon states to accept this as an understanding to move forward. It would be it would be perceived as a setback. So I think that we need to distinguish between encouraging nuclear weapon states to change their nuclear doctrines and to address this as a welcome development or as a signal for more stability or for risk reduction, and to include that into the narrative of the non-nuclear weapon states that have already renounced nuclear weapons and abolished the possibility of having them or endorsing them in any way or form. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Liddle wanted to come in on the issue as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so I think the first thing to say is that there are obviously some doctrinal things that you can do which contribute to risk reduction. Obviously, you know, having a nuclear threshold as high as possible is one of them. Anything you can do to lengthen decision-making times in a crisis, obviously de-alerting, de-targeting, these sorts of things contribute as well. But just purely from a risk reduction point of view, I'm not convinced actually that no first use is a risk reduction measure. And there's a whole load of different conversations you can have about no first use from a sort of deterrence point of view, which I won't go into. But there are sort of three, bearing in mind what I said earlier about miscalculation, misunderstanding, and the risks from conventional escalation. I think they highlight some risks with looking at no first use in this way. The first is that no first use only contributes to trust if that doctrine matches up with that state's capabilities. If a state has a no first use doctrine, but has a whole range of nuclear capabilities which don't seem to serve that doctrine, then that undermines trust. It doesn't enhance it. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, even if a state does have a no first use doctrine and it has a capability that you might sort of think matches up with it, can you trust that it would hold in a crisis? It's one thing saying that in peacetime, but you know, in a crisis, I think you'd have to have a very high degree of trust that a state would actually stick by that. And of course, if you don't trust them, then that sort of it implies a certain degree of hedging. And then the third thing is, the reason a lot of European states object to or are skeptical about no first use is because of the risk of that encouraging then conventional escalation. So if you have a no first use doctrine, does that it actually encourage, does it lower the threshold for conventional conflicts, and does that then sort of set in train escalation dynamics that you might not be able to control? So I think just off the top of my head, and these are my own personal views, but off the top of my head, I can think of 3 good reasons why no first use doctrine wouldn't actually be a risk reduction measure, and in fact might even contribute to increasing risk in some circumstances. So I think you've got to be a bit careful with that.
Thank you. To pick up on something you said and maybe stay with you, you mentioned the matching capabilities in states possibly having in a few, but not necessarily being trustworthy with that. And not to point fingers, but one of the questions was, how do we effectively engage China and Russia in the nuclear risk discussions, be it in the P5 context or in some kind of other format, and sort of any thoughts you might want to share on this, both you and other speakers. And also to add to that, since you pointed out a number of reasons you don't think no first use policy is a particularly effective or not ineffective at all nuclear risk reduction measure, one of the questions for all the speakers was, what would you name as the one single most effective policy that nuclear armed states can adopt now to reduce the risk of a nuclear exchange? So we'll start with you, Ambassador Liddle, and then go in reverse order.
Okay, so I suppose on the first question, I mean, obviously, we've been having these discussions in the P5. Much like Reto said, we haven't made as much progress on the trickier issues as we would have liked to have done, because we haven't been able to get our experts all together in a room and to talk about this stuff face to face in the last year. And that has held us back, to be honest. But I think, all of the members of the P5 have expressed the willingness to work not only on doctrines, but on risk reduction more generally. That was a commitment at the London P5 conference back in February last year. We've got a bit of time, as everyone keeps on saying, till the RevCon. How much time we don't quite know, but we're obviously committed to working on this together. But I think these are issues that you can make some progress on within the P5, and you can certainly set some sort of parameters and some common understandings in the P5. But really, when you get into the nuts and bolts of risk reduction, that's really got to be sort of taken forward bilaterally. And so it's great from our perspective that the US and Russia are signaling their willingness to get back to strategic stability talks. We very much hope the US and China can sit down and do likewise, because I think that would, to answer your second question, probably be the single biggest contribution we can make in the short term to reducing the risk, at least amongst P5 member states. As I said earlier, there are also sources of nuclear risk outside the P5, which I think would be well worth discussing in another forum. But that's probably it for the NPT anyway.
Thank you. Who would like to go next, specifically on the question of what would you consider the single most effective policy that nuclear armed states can adopt to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons or a risk of a nuclear exchange?
I'd be happy to go ahead if you allow me.
Sure.
I don't think there is a single one most important thing. That's why we came up with a package, and I do think also that it is very important to take a differentiated approach. The US and Russia are in a very different situation. China has a responsibility here. I think there's still some that France and the UK can do more. So I don't think it's one particular policy measure, but I do think, and that brings us back to what Tony said, I think all 5 nuclear weapon states should contribute to turning the tide. We need a reverse movement. We need to, and I think that's what Tony said. We need to go back to what is in the very first paragraph of the risk reduction paper. The best risk reduction measure is the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. And we have to go back into that direction. And currently we seem to go in the opposite direction. But individually, the P5 can all take measures and contribute to a sustained effort. I think agreeing on a process, no matter what it looks like, I agree it's very early on, form follows function, point taken. But I think the willingness, the readiness to engage on a process in the NPT and beyond, that would be a great contribution.
Thank you. Tony, please.
I would like to add maybe some actions that might not be effective for the risk reduction or reduction of nuclear war, as you put it, but maybe can create more confidence in the NPT review cycle, and that can help or foster more dialogue, I think. My crystal ball is not working today, so to predict if these are going to be very useful or not. But I think that something that might be, to a certain point, effective is that the nuclear weapon states together don't deny the existence of previous commitments under the treaty. I am not saying that they will that all of these are going to be or the previous commitments were going to be and obligations were going to be easily implemented. But the signal that we would be waiting for is a recognition of their existence and not a denial of the existence and implementation need. I think that because risk reduction measures are, as I said before, subjective in nature, and politics in general is made of signals sometimes, we would need a signal from the P5 that they are not denying their previous commitments and obligations. This would ease a lot of the tension and would be a confidence building measure inside of the NPT review cycle environment. Whether these can foster more dialogue and help to ease tensions in general, stands to be seen. I don't know if that is going to happen, because unfortunately it has not happened in the past 10 years. We have been hearing that the commitments were very difficult to be implemented and that they are not current or relevant anymore. So this is why these initiatives, the Stockholm Initiative and other initiatives and papers that are being put, start from the departure point of recognizing that many of the steps that are already agreed, many of the steps towards the elimination of nuclear weapons and towards the strengthening of the regime were already agreed and are already there, and we need to see how they were implemented, and that would be a confidence building measure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Heather, you wanted to come in as well, yes?
Yeah, I just had a couple of points to your question. What's the single most effective thing? I don't think this is necessarily the most effective, but I think it would be the most effective and potentially achievable would be something like a 21st century version of the Incidents at Sea agreement, in terms of avoiding rising nuclear risk or potential nuclear use, potentially in the area of cyber. AI, since we really don't have much transparency yet on how AI might be incorporated into nuclear decision making. Hopefully not too much. But I and quite a few others have repeatedly recommended that the P5, for example, come up with a joint agreement to always keep a human in the loop in nuclear decision making. That's just one version, but I think the Incidents at Sea agreements are a really helpful model that we might consider. And if I could just make a few other points. Very quickly, I thought that Reto's point was a really helpful one about how that first paragraph of the working paper really outlines what the initiative is working towards, and that is complete elimination. I don't mean to be, I don't really want to stir up this whole argument altogether, but I think that trying to work towards complete elimination requires looking at why countries possess and rely on these weapons in the first place. I know that we all disagree on what those drivers and motives might be, but for the nuclear possessors, it is because of security concerns and security environment. And so I think that part of that also should be part of the discussion. Again, I thought that the paper did a really nice job of capturing different angles here. Just to Tony's point, Aidan can answer this. I don't know if the UK reporting, the NPT reporting has been publicly released, but I actually thought that included some really helpful language on past commitments, which I would strongly encourage the rest of the P5, particularly the United States, to consider adopting. I'm sure it's not going to go as far in terms of past commitments as quite a few non-nuclear weapon states would like, but I thought it was a really good signal. As Tony said, signals matter, and so hopefully that could be a starting point. Thanks.
Thank you. We have just a little bit of time left and questions continue to come in. So I apologize to our attendees for not being able to pose all of your questions to the extent possible. I'm trying to group them together thematically. And another group that came up in several questions is the interest in maybe a bit more elaboration, detail on the ideas on the process, and that they come up several times, right? And the post-RevCon process of engagement on nuclear risk reduction. And one of the questions had to do with whether that would include having track 1.5 meetings, for example, involving nuclear weapon states, nuclear armed states, non-nuclear weapon states, trying to kind of enhance the mutual understanding and strategic stability as well. And then more concrete questions about the paper itself and some of its proposals. For example, about the high-level conference on nuclear risk and what would be an expected outcome of such a high-level conference, and then more practically how to organize this intersessional discussion process, whether that would include having different focal points, facilitators, working groups. And I understand this is really getting into the weeds that we didn't want to predetermine in the paper, but any kind of thoughts on that would be welcome. Reto, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I'll get that started, but I'd be very happy if others can come in on this. I mean, look, it is early stages. It is what it is. We have put some ideas on paper, to enable discussions like today, knowing that, that in the end, it depends on many things. I mean, can give you one example. I think whatever we decide on nuclear risk reduction on the way forward will depend very much on the structure of the subsidiary bodies. How would the subsidiary body one chair, tackle this issue? How would she or he go forward in this endeavor? And we thought putting this on paper, one possible avenue with, having it as on the agenda with co-facilitators, reporting back over the cycle, that would be one way forward to keep the issue very much alive and to allow for a structured discussion. So we don't go to New York and decide on nuclear risk reduction language, and then we forget about this issue for a number of months, but you would actually have somebody in charge to move this forward over the first, second, third PrepCon. We know the game. It's just one way forward. It depends then, as I said, on the structure of the review conference, what happens in other subsidiary bodies, etc. I would just also like to say a few words about the idea of a nuclear risk reduction summit. The question also came up, would this be a track 1 thing or track 1.5? I think the primary idea of a high-level engagement is to move things forward beyond the regular UN conferences. It has an added value if you can bring in the ministers. And that also relates very much to the nature of the Stockholm Initiative, which very much lives from the buy-in of the ministers. And having such a summit, let's imagine that we have a large number of ministers at the RefCon, at the opening high-level segment, and many of them will say, we need to reduce risk, we need to reduce risk. It would be kind of a nice follow-up to these discussions at the NPT to continue them, perhaps in an extended format, including perhaps also states outside the NPT, including also the experts of civil society, and have a series of high-level meetings prepared by Sherpas, the idea of gift baskets. I mean, there's lots of ideas. I think it could be given the traction that this issue has, given the appetite of many countries to work on this, it could be a very promising area to go beyond the NPT. As I said, also, it is what it is. For the moment, it's we're testing the temperature, and I think it is one of the ideas that I referred to in the beginning that would deserve probably a little bit more scrutiny to see what exactly do we mean, how exactly would we move this forward. But I hope it can trigger some thoughts everywhere.
Thank you very much. We're practically out of time, so any speakers who want to answer this question are also welcome to tag along any final thoughts they wish to express before we close the webinar. And no, no takers. All right. Well, with 1 minute to spare, I dare not pose the next group of questions, and would just like to thank you all for joining us as speakers today. To thank the Stockholm Initiative and Switzerland for producing this paper, and evidently it's giving a lot of food for thought, judging by the number and topics in the questions that came in. And I would also like to thank all the attendees for tuning in and submitting your thoughts and questions. And again, apologies for not being able to cover all of them. As Elena mentioned, this is the first webinar in a series devoted to the NPT and the ever upcoming 10th review conference. So we'll hope to see you again. And for any concluding words, I'm happy to pass the floor back to Elena.
Thank you, Gaukhar. You already said what needs to be said. And first of all, thanking our panelists. I think it was a very interesting discussion, very stimulating discussion. And as a last word by Reto, it's definitely gave a lot of food for thought and further exploration how to move things forward. So thank you, all of you, for your excellent contributions and for stimulating discussion and further thinking along these issues. And thanks for all of our listeners who tuned in, either through Zoom or on YouTube. And stay tuned for future events. Thank you all. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll look forward to hopefully an announcement in the next couple of days when exactly that that NPT 10th Review Conference going to take place. With that, have a really nice afternoon, and goodbye to everyone.